Hi, everybody. I chose The Mission for my media review. For those of you who don't know, this film relates to our work in this course on colonial Latin American history, in that it is set in what was then the Spanish province of Paraguay in 1750. The subject matter of the film revolves around the missionary work of the Jesuit priests among the Guarani natives, and it also brings into the story some of the conflicts with Iberians in regards to enslavement of the Guarani and the power struggle between Portugal and Spain for control and influence in this region. Part of this power struggle that features prominently in the film is the Treaty of Madrid in 1750. This was an attempt by both Spain and Portugal to solve border disputes and to secure their interests in the region. Part of the treaty required Spain to cede territory that included a number of Jesuit missions to Portugal and instructed the Jesuits to leave carrying only their belongings and gave the option for the Guarani in these missions to settle on other lands within Spanish territory. Basically, they were being evicted. These missions happened to be some of the most populated and prosperous operations of all, so abandoning them to the Portuguese was no small thing for those who inhabited them, Jesuits and Guarani alike. They had been in existence for more than a century, and the Guarani who inhabited them knew no other life for the most part and had adopted to mission life. The Jesuits protested vehemently, but ultimately to no avail. The Guarani, many of whom were educated and literate by this time, also lodged protests with the Spanish crown, but again unsuccessfully. In 1754, the Jesuits abandoned control of the missions, but the Guarani refused to do so, all on their own, I might add. In 1756, the Guarani War was fought with the Guarani mission dwellers on one side and the combined troops of Spain and Portugal on the other. The Guarani were defeated and forced to abandon their homes. So there's just a brief outline of the historical context for the film. The Mission was released in 1986 and was produced by David Putnam, directed by Roland Joffe, and the screenplay was written by Robert Bolt, who has also been the writer on several other historical films, including Lawrence of Arabia, Dr. Zhivago, The Bounty, and A Man for All Seasons. Robert Bolt holds an honors degree from the University of Manchester, so he is no doubt aware of the history surrounding the story of the film. I have to think that where the film diverts from fact, it is to attempt to tell a compelling story about the Guaranis and the Jesuits in the space of a 2-hour film, and probably also to give prominent roles to the Jesuits who could be played by big-name actors like Robert De Niro and Jeremy Irons. Filmed on location in Colombia, the film uses natives of that region that are not Guarani, nor do they speak Guarani when there is native dialogue in the film. Having roles for big-name actors was probably necessary for a production of this type, as it was undoubtedly very expensive to make. The sets and the costumes are stunning, and the viewer truly does feel as if they are transported back in time to this place in history. So the Mission did not do all that well upon release, either critically or at the box office. I found a review by Roger Ebert from 1986 that states the following. The Mission feels exactly like one of those movies where you'd rather see the documentary about how the movie was made. You'd like to know why so many talented people went to such incredible lengths to make a difficult and beautiful movie without any of them, on the basis of the available evidence, having the slightest notion of what the movie was about. There isn't a moment in the Mission that is not watchable, but the moments don't add up to a coherent narrative. At the end, we can sort of piece things together, but the movie has never really made us care. And I think that's a pretty good summation of the film. It is beautiful, no doubt, but it is not particularly coherent, in either as a film or as history. So in the Mission, we have several storylines going on at the same time, and this might be part of the problem with the film. We have Cardinal Altamirano, who narrates a good bit of it, and according to the film, has been sent by the Pope to determine the fate of the Jesuit Guarani missions. We have Father Gabriel, who is a Jesuit priest who takes on the task of bringing Christianity to the Guarani above the falls. after his predecessor is martyred. We also have a slaver and mercenary, Rodrigo Mendoza, who is disgraced for murdering his brother, does penitence for this at the urging of Father Gabriel. We have the power struggle between Portugal and Spain that swirls around the terms of the Treaty of Madrid in 1750 and which culminates in the Guarani War. I think part of the difficulty with the film lies in trying to cover too much ground. For example, the character of Rodrigo Mendoza, the slaver and mercenary, really feels just like an excuse to give Robert De Niro a role to play because it is totally extraneous to the rest of the storyline. So what do I think the film got right? Well, it is simply visually stunning, even on a small screen, and I imagine it is even more so on a big one. The sets and the costumes are elaborate and seemingly accurate to the time period for the most part, although there are a few scenes where you have mostly half-naked Guaranis running around the missions, and this would probably not have been countenanced by the Jesuits. The cinematography and music are first-rate, and the film is a treat for the eyes and ears. Historically speaking, there was some killing of Jesuit priests by the Guarani. Enslavement by the Portuguese was indeed at one time a problem for the Guarani. There were indeed vast and thriving Jesuit missions among the Guarani. And finally, there was indeed a Guarani War that involved armed conflict with the Spanish and Portuguese. The problem is that these things didn't all happen in 1750, and for the most part, not in the way portrayed in the film. In the opening sequence, we see a Jesuit priest tied to a cross. He wears a crown of thorns. The natives carry him through the jungle to the riverbank where they toss him in. He floats downstream to his death by going over a spectacular waterfall. This is all visually stunning, but there is no historical record for anybody being killed in this fashion. Jesuits were killed by the Guarani in the early years of contact, but were quickly accepted and came to be regarded as allies and not enemies. This type of thing simply wasn't going on in 1750. In another scene, we see the slaver Mendoza capturing a whole group of Guarani by ensnaring them in a net in the jungle. Slave raids certainly took place, and Guarani were sold to the Portuguese, but again much earlier in history than 1750. That whole scene is ludicrous to me because the thought of a Spanish slaver entrapping Guarani in a clumsy net trap in their own home territory is a bit far-fetched. Actually, the whole characterization of the Guarani as forest-dwelling hunter-gatherers in this film is a bit off, as well, because they were actually slash-and-burn agriculturalists. The character of Altamirano figures prominently in the film, and he is based on a real character, but the real character was a Jesuit representative and not a cardinal sent by the Pope. His job was to simply administer the transfer of the missions and not in any way to decide their fate, as is portrayed in the film. And finally, we have the climax of the movie when we have the battle at the fictional mission of San Carlos, which is there to depict the Guarani War. The Guarani by this time period had their own militia and were the main military force in that part of Spanish America. They were organized, trained, and armed by the Jesuits and were instrumental in providing their own defense from Portuguese slave raiders. They ultimately made the decision to defy authority and resist removal from the missions all on their own, and not led by Jesuits, as is depicted in the film. So what can we conclude about the mission? Well, first and foremost, I enjoy the film. It is simply gorgeous to watch and listen to, and you can definitely be transported to another time and place. And in this way, it can serve to be a catalyst for discovering more about what really went on back in 1750. But to use the film as a template for all of this is a bit problematic. As other reviewers have pointed out, it tries to cover too much ground and to condense 200 years of history into one. Besides that, even the individual episodes from throughout that span come at the viewer with a bit of distortion about the nature of the relationships between the Jesuits and the Guarani converts. Worth watching? Definitely. Historically accurate? Not so much. And that's my presentation. Thank you for watching and listening.